Welcome to what is meant to be a workshop. So eventually I'll probably take off my jacket because I have to do some work on high impact IR presentations, and particularly on what I would call how to increase the impact of IR presentations. We've heard a lot about stuff the last few hours probably. If you take the front page of today's Börsenzeitung, clearly Alstom is in serious need of investor relations, but so is Siemens, so is GE, so is Mitsubishi. In fact, everybody who's involved in this transaction is in need of investor relations, and everybody needs to convince their investors that this is potentially a good deal on the buy side and on the sell side. And this really brings home how important actual high-level investor relations is to actually get a strategy done. My name is Marc Monasch. I'm a managing director at the Kingstree Group in London. Kingstree has been around since 1983 and has developed high-impact communication strategies for IR events, for IPOs, for M&A sell-side processes, or for anything else where a senior executive needs to communicate, typically outside of his or her comfort zone. And as we go through the presentation, I'll try to give you some of the tips that we normally give our senior executive clients to increase their overall effectiveness. But let's start with the focus on IR, and let's think about the three key theses that we would apply to any kind of IR communication. I'm sure that you probably all agree that these three theses are probably, right, key element of what you do on a daily basis. Every capital market communications event aims to create shareholder value. That might be a strong expression, especially in Germany, but certainly in the UK and in the US, that is probably 99% of the time fact. The second thesis is it's a great opportunity to remind investors of the strategy and the journey. And that links directly with the third thesis. It is not just about results. The results are the evidence. The result is not the strategy, I would assume. And as a result, we would suggest, let's not make an IR presentation purely about results, but link it with strategy and the journey that I just mentioned. So where does this take us? I'm going to ask a number of questions in the headers and try to answer those questions throughout with the material that I'm presenting. If you have any questions, please feel free just to jump in, ask questions, shoot me down if you don't agree with me. That's all fine. Let's make it interactive, and eventually I will take off my jacket because it's actually pretty warm in here too. So if anybody wants to, I would suggest you might do the same. How to maximize value from high-impact IR presentations, IR communications. I would like to suggest that every communication only needs to achieve two objectives: a clear communication of messages and a clear communication of professional credibility. And with this, I mean the journey, the strategy. Where are we going? What does the market need to hear? And with this, it's typically about conviction. An investor that's invested in your stock needs to see that management actually is behind it, that management believes what they're saying, that management will deliver on the strategy. Because believe it or not, and I think you probably will all agree with me, if you take these 2 points together, everybody who listens will not only judge you on the objective facts, they will also make a subjective judgment about your ability to deliver. And whether or not that's a chief executive of a DAX Unternehmen or the IR professional of a tech DAX Unternehmen, doesn't matter. Everybody is looking for conviction at the end of the day. If you take these together, what do you get? Generally speaking, you make a lasting positive impression. And you show conviction. And I would pose that that's high impact And that will help you maximize value. So how are we going to do that?
Can you give a percentage of what the impact is of the two main issues we have here? So what is more convincing? Is it more the clear communication of the key messages, or the credibility of, let's say, the subjective and the more the objective? Say it's 50-50, or is it different?
There's no hard and fast rule. But it's a very interesting question, and it's not an unsurprising question to come from a more German-focused room. See, I'm Dutch, so I can be as direct and rude as I want to be. It's a very interesting question. If you take the average German approach, Dutch approach, by the way, we're all the same when it comes to that, very direct, very fact-oriented. As long as the facts are fine, I am fine. And it doesn't matter how I'm communicating it. If you look at German CEOs and CFOs and Dutch ones too, even when they communicate in English and say they communicate very fluently in English, oftentimes all they are really doing is focusing on the facts. And everything else is called theater. We don't need to present because it's about the facts, the technology, the product. You go to an Anglo-Saxon world, this is actually potentially more important than the facts. And so while I can't really put a percentage on it, right, I would say they're both equally important. And investors will judge you on both. If you don't have conviction, the facts can be very good. You're still not going to get the result you want. The facts are great. That's a sine qua non for most companies. This will then get you where you want to be. This is very interesting once you start doing this for, let's say, IPOs, for management teams who've never done this before. They first need to explain the company. What does the company really do? They can do that until the cows come home. Can they do this? Not always. And it has a huge impact on value at the end of the day. So now let's say, how are we going to do this? Right? Basically, and it sounds really silly, it's a combination of three elements. What to say, how to say it, and keep on saying it. And with the keep on saying it, I don't mean the cliche. Kind of tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them again what you just told them, because that's a bit cliche. But it's actually much more subtle. If you think about a management presentation or any kind of IR event that you're doing, it's not just about the presentation. It's about the interaction you can create with your audience. If you can create an interaction with the audience, the chances are the audience is much more engaged and is much more likely to absorb the points you want to make. Now, how do you do that? It's actually shut up and take some questions would be the right way of doing it if people are actually engaged and ask you questions. So thank you very much for asking questions. It's much more effective to actually keep on saying what you are saying by answering questions linked to what you're saying than mindlessly repeating what you have just said all the time. So that's what I mean by keep on saying it. So let's just ask the one question that most people will probably ask of investors. Right, buy me some more shares, or buy some more shares in my company, please. Great. The question investors are going to ask is, why should I buy some more shares? And you put yourself in the position of the investor, how are you going to answer that question for him or her? What to say? Focus on the investor's agenda. It's not about what you want to tell them, it's what they need to hear. I'll come back on this message-driven structure in a second. How to say it. Make sure that you present well. Whether or not you sit around the table flipping a book, or whether or not you're standing up in front of an audience, or whether or not you are doing it by phone, it doesn't really matter. Make sure you have maximum impact in delivery. And we'll get to that later as well. And then, as I said, reinforce it in Q&A. Use Q&A to keep on delivering your messages. That's the integrated approach, 1, 2, 3, that should get you to maximize your objectives. Now, there's a little gimmick I just did. There's a blank page here, which means you actually have to look at me, listen to me, and can't be distracted at looking at any slides. I'm going to suggest that a lot of people will find this really, really scary to do. I'm not referring to the looking at me bit. This is for many people very difficult. It means you have to draw the attention to you. But I suppose it actually has great impact when you're presenting. Takes a bit of confidence, I think. So where do we go from here? I said earlier, key messages. How do I make sure that the audience will remember my key message? That's basically focusing on the structure of the presentation. First of all, focus on the audience. What do they need to hear? We can do all kinds of neuro-linguistic programming or whatever we want to do about, at the end of the day, how audiences react. But it really comes down to what do they need to hear. Secondly, grab their attention. Sounds like a gimmick, certainly not very commonly used, but I'll show you in a second how effective it is. Maintain their attention. Driven by structure, I'll come back to that shortly. And make it easy to remember. You want your audience to leave remembering why they should be buying your shares. If you accomplish that, there's a higher chance you'll be buying your shares than if you didn't. How do we do this? It's a very simple structure approach to any presentation. It consists of 4 elements: key messages, evidence, strong start, conclusion. I suggest that there is no intermixing between these two. It's either a key message or evidence. Never both. Now I think about a results presentation.
Can you explain a little bit deeper what you mean by evidence here? Sorry.
Good question, and I was just going to do that. Because I'm just going to take the average results presentation for a moment as a concept. Right? I'm not suggesting anybody does it this way, but nonetheless I'm using it as a concept. Evidence. So the evidence is whatever you need to prove a key message. It is not a stag of facts that you think you want to communicate. Right? We all went to school at some point in the past, and I presume most of you have university degrees. We all learned in the past that we prepare an outline first, then think about what the main theses are, and then start writing. Since Bill Gates is giving us PowerPoint, we actually start the other way around. We start with the evidence, and then think what the evidence is going to give us. Right? Aside from the fact that it's not very effective and very time-consuming, you don't necessarily know what the evidence is you need to make the points you want to make. So start here with the key messages, and then develop the evidence you need. And I'll even suggest you're going to save yourself a lot of time doing that, because you don't have to dig for stuff that you don't need. Now I said that there's strong start. Lots of ways to think about how you can start. But we all know that that's the moment of maximum impact. If you know that's your moment of maximum impact, why do so many people start their presentation with a relatively meek introduction? Hi, I'm so-and-so. I'm 50 years old. I have 5 kids, 3 dogs, and I like sailing. None of those things apply to me, by the way. But you're not necessarily finding that a particularly striking introduction to someone who's going to actually supposed to be entertaining you for the next hour. Or right? Even more in a professional setting, what's the point? How many senior executives will tell them actually, will tell you where they went to university 30 years ago? Is it relevant in the introduction? Barely. Barely. But they will tell you. Right? What's relevant? Strong start. That's where you capture your audience from the very beginning. And if you can't grab them from the very beginning, chances are you're not going to keep them either. Now this will then allow you not only to grab it at the strong start bit, but also to maintain it. Because every time I communicate a message, chances are I can draw you back to me. Or I just do this stupid thing and give you a blank slide, and I'll try to draw you back. But key messages will draw people back into the conversation, into your presentation. And then you give as much evidence as you need to support that key message. If my message is, and I'll give you a very concrete example, about, I don't know, 7 years ago, Shell, the big Dutch oil company, needed a new chief executive because they found a huge hole in their reserves accounting. It's a bit of a bummer if you're an oil company, you find out about 25% of what you thought were reserves aren't there. So what they did is they kicked out the very erudite British chief executive who could communicate very well and replaced him with a relatively dour 6'5" tall Dutchman. But the Dutchman was purposely chosen to be dour because Shell needed to regain confidence from the investors. What did he do? He basically set out a very simple strategy to communicate to investors and actually run the company. 2 prongs. More upstream, profitable downstream. That gives you a framework for everything you ever need to communicate to investors. And that's what he used. So every time he would go in front of investors and something had happened, he'd say, now let's talk about more upstream. We need more upstream. It's very unfortunate Mr. Putin has decided to take away half my stake in Sakhalin Island, but we need more upstream, so I'm going to still keep it. And then you keep on going, and you build that up around this whole key messaging bit, around those 2 points every single time. And you can draw investors, your whole audience back every single time to it. And the evidence can be whatever it is. More upstream, higher revenues, higher profitability, profitable downstream. Evidence, I just sold loss-making businesses in Africa. The evidence is the right evidence to support the point. Focus on the key messages. Use the data as evidence, as proof points. Try not to mix the two of them. This is much more powerful. This is just the backup. So I'll give you an idea how not to do it when I'm just looking at the messages. And this is a real-life example. It's anonymized, but literally there were 12 key messages as to why I should be buying this company. So I sit down with the chief executive and I said, well, this doesn't really help me very much deciding whether I want to buy your company. And we actually took these 12 and then came up with this. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but it's an example of how effective you can actually make key messages that resonate with a specific audience. If you look at this, this is very simple, right? This is life in private equity, right? If I'm a private equity buyer, all I need to know is about growth, profits, and cash. I've just literally translated these 12 lengthy sentences into 3.5 points that resonate extremely well to a potential private equity buyer. And now all I need to do is just provide the evidence that this is actually really true. So here, they have a 40% sustainable EBIT margin. Any private equity company would salivate at the idea of buying a company with a 40% sustainable EBIT margin. 3 years of historical financials as evidence. 40% plus, 40% plus. Every new product I've introduced, only if it makes the 40% margin. I have plenty of evidence to make this point. I'm sure it's somewhere in here too, but it doesn't come out very well. So think about what your audience needs to hear and focus the key messages on what the audience needs to hear.
Which number of key messages do you think is the best? Say 4, 5, 10?
Well, if you work for McKenzie, 3. But in the real world, it's anywhere between 2 and 5. Right? It doesn't matter. Right? You, at some point, need to remember what they were. I'll give you a funny example. I don't know, I presume, right? I'm not a very good cook. But I'm sitting in the sofa Friday night watching Holland against Spain. And I hear my wife from the kitchen kind of like, she's not paying attention to this football thing. And she's mumbling something from the kitchen. It's like, I need to make pancakes tomorrow morning. Can you please go to the supermarket and buy some flour, eggs, and milk? Right? I'm not a very good cook, so eventually I'll go to the supermarket after the game. I go to the supermarket, walk around there, and it's like, oh yeah, beer, yeah, buy some beer, buy some wine, buy some strawberries, buy other stuff, and it's like, oh shit, what am I supposed to buy? She wants to make pancakes, but I hadn't really thought about what that means. If you'd actually told me I need to buy flour, eggs, and milk, chances are that I might have remembered it. Now, it's a very simplistic way of describing what messages could be, but essentially the message was, buy me flour, eggs, and milk. Properly communicated, I might remember them. Now I can go and figure out what I need to buy. It doesn't matter if it's 3, 4, or 5, but it's how the number and how you communicate them. And we'll get to the how you communicate them in a second, but I think you already get a gist from, let's say, flour, eggs, and milk to flour, eggs, and milk. Yes?
Is it possible that she just asked you at the wrong moment? Would she have asked you after the match? Would you have remembered?
Not necessarily.
That's marriage counseling, something.
Yeah. The interesting thing is, and this comes back to the point I just made earlier, you should assume that you always need to play at the top of your game. And that applies at home just as much as at work, apparently. Always play at the top of your game. You can't afford to make an off-the-cuff statement to one of your key shareholders about flour, eggs, and milk, at which point he hasn't figured out yet what he's supposed to be doing. Right? So assume for a moment that it doesn't matter when you do it. Now let me go one step further. Whatever the key messages are, however many there may be, whatever process you are running, and this is clearly an IPO type process that I've just laid out, but anybody who's doing a capital increase will have exactly the same concept. Anybody who's doing a capital markets day event actually will have a pretty similar type process. Once you've identified your messages, they should be the same throughout the entire process. They become second nature. I now know that it needs flour, eggs, and milk to make pancakes. I didn't know that before. Once you've defined them, stick to them. And they run you through the entire process on the left-hand side, from the actual transaction to the non-deal roadshows you'll be doing after the results or whatever it is, right? It'll help everybody else here on the other side to really do their job. It'll help the analyst update their model. It'll help the investors to buy the shares. It makes life a lot easier this way. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about yet is actually what I call the elevator pitch. We've talked about messages. 2, 3, 4, 5 key messages. That's not the elevator pitch. How many of you know, how many of you can, in 30 seconds, tell me why I should be buying shares in your companies? Now, either you're not putting up your hand because I'm going to ask you to tell me in 30 seconds why I should be buying your shares, and you're not interested in doing that, or you don't know. You don't do a 30-second elevator pitch. So I'm sitting with the chief executive of a very large German DAX Unternehmen. And I said, you know who I just ran into in the hotel? He goes, no idea, of course. How would I know? I said, well, I ran into Warren Buffett. What do you mean? Warren Buffett is in Berlin or Frankfurt or Hamburg or wherever it is in Germany. It doesn't matter. Right? But let's take Berlin because it's easy, because Warren Buffett actually does go to Berlin because he likes Berlin. So we're in Berlin. Yeah, Warren Buffett is in Berlin. He loves Berlin. He comes to Berlin all the time. I said, so would you like Warren Buffett to become a shareholder in your company? He goes, it would be great to have an anchor investor like Berkshire Hathaway as a shareholder in my company. It would be spectacular. How do we do that? I said, well, I know Warren. I've done some work with him in the past and I've given some investment ideas in the past. Great. Can you get Warren to come and meet? Sure. No problem. Right? Let's go back to the Adlon and get him. Oh, okay. Question to you. What are you going to say to Warren when I ask him to come and talk to you? Oh. Yeah, that's a very good question. I hadn't thought about that yet. Eventually came up with the idea that, yeah, I am the 5th largest company in our industry. So I said to him, do you know who Warren Buffett is? Yeah, I know. I said, well, do you know what Warren Buffett typically invests in? No. Well, Coca-Cola and Goldman Sachs. Clear number ones in whatever it is that they do. So number 5 really isn't hitting the spot with Warren Buffett very closely. I make a very silly point, and clearly this was all role play made up, and the chief executive had actually initially no idea that I was just pulling his chain, but nonetheless, it worked very nicely for him to recognize that he needs to work on his elevator pitch. Because how often will he actually come across an investor where he's asked that question and needs to answer it in 30 seconds? How often do you? You pass the 30-second test, you might actually, Warren might say, okay, walk with me. Right? And you have 2 more minutes or so until Warren gets to wherever Warren needs to be. You need to pass that test too. And only then Warren says, okay, fine, I'll give you 15 minutes. Right? You're not going to get much past the Warren Buffetts of the world until you actually hook them. And that sounds very American, but actually that's the world today. 30 seconds to start is key. If you don't have your 30-second elevator pitch, you may not get beyond the first 30 seconds. Now let's take this one step further in terms of how we build what we would call a high-impact presentation. So I said before, let's start with the key messages. Figure out what they are. Strategy-driven, long-term vision-driven. Where do you want to take the company? How often actually can a chief executive not tell you where he wants to take the company? Because he's just stuck in the results. Well, it actually happens quite often. Your job as IR would be actually to push that capital markets oriented long-term vision to the forefront of the thinking. That's what's going to drive your key messages for your IR presentation. Then the evidence. Whatever evidence you need. A new organizational structure of something. Numbers, facts, it doesn't matter. Whatever you need to make and prove the point. Strong start, whatever elevator pitch or whatever key message you want to start with. The higher level. I want to double the size of my company. And here's how I'm going to do it. 1, 2, 3. if you say, I want to double the size of the company, chances are you're going to have people listening to you for a while. Strong start. Probably need to conclude it. And only when we're done with this do we decide, do I actually need a slide? That's a bit simplistic, but in reality, right, that's how I would typically suggest you do it. Now this works for the whole presentation, but it's actually how you present every single slide as well. So I'll go back to the point I made earlier. Capture attention is one thing, strong start. Maintain attention is more difficult. If you present well, you start every single slide with a strong statement, with the message. That's how you draw them back in again. And you then present the evidence on the slide in the degree of detail you need. Start every time here. This is just a backup. Don't get stuck in the numbers. The numbers are just there to prove that the point you're making is actually true. I said this before, what does the audience need to hear? That, at the end of the day, is the critical question that everybody needs to address. How do we do this? First, develop the key messages. Right? Clear, whatever they may be, I don't care, and frankly, I don't care how many, right? Provided I can remember them. Because I need to leave the room remembering the key messages. Use the key messages to structure the presentation. It's not about just a functional order of stuff that you need to get through. Key messages really help you drive the audience through the whole story much more effectively than going, let me give you an update on sales. Let me give you an update on marketing. Let me give you an update on product development. Let me give you an update on factory production. It's not very exciting. If there's a key message there, chances are people will pay much more attention. Right? Prepare the deck with the relevant evidence. And finally, and that's where I'm going to spend the next few minutes, draft the script and the speaker notes. You'd be surprised, but actually many chief executives, even for transactions, are fully scripted. Frequently, not because they don't know what they're going to say, but because they actually want to limit the prospect liability, and therefore everybody needs to be scripted. They want to know what everybody's going to say in an analyst presentation. Or frequently, their command of the English language isn't that good. And therefore they want to be fully scripted so they don't have to spend the time thinking about what they're going to say in English. I've just did an IPO in Spain. Every single person of an 11-person management team had a full script. How they deliver it is a separate issue, and we make sure that they deliver it well, but every single one of them had a full script. You do an AGM, obviously, right? For legal reasons, it's mostly fully scripted. It's the same thing. It's the next step once you know what actually you're going to say. That gets you to this message-driven structure. Now I have 3 slides here which are very simple, simplistic, and straightforward as a concept. Right? Again, let's take an average type of structure for a presentation. My strong start is I'm a global leader in market share and financial performance. That's my vision for my company as a CEO. I want to give you 4 messages. I'm going to grow faster than the market. I'm going to improve margins. Really have strong cash generation. And I'm going to basically grow through M&A and consolidate the market. Those are the 4 messages I want you to leave with. So I just start writing them down, right? So this is the first cut of what I would call the presentation outline. If you use multiple presenters, actually, you can also then allocate each of these key messages to someone which is relevant. An idea. Above market growth. That's a CEO's job. Strategy, growth. Margin improvement. The COO's job. The nasty person who's just cutting cost. He will be presenting margin improvement, cash generation, the CFO's job, working capital management, hedging, raising capital, right? CFO's job. And then we're done with it. We'll come back to the CEO telling me he's actually going to dominate the whole world. And now you have a presentation that actually every single presenter has a key message to deliver. Rather than, I'll just be very simplistic, right? Update on sales, right? Update on profits, or operations, let's say update on operations, update on financial results, yeah, future strategy. So that's not a bad outline for a presentation. We then work it out further and come up with sub-bullets, right? Don't worry about reading it, it's not the point, right? But it's like, you start with a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're the same. You add a layer of detail. If you really want to, you add another layer of detail. You can leisurely turn these 5 points into any presentation. 5 pages, 25 pages, 125 pages. Doesn't matter. But if you start with this, the chances are that this will resonate. And this then just becomes the deck. So now let's think about the script for a second. That's the presentation I have, whichever format we actually have. So now let's focus on the script. First of all, include a strong start. That might be a challenge for some of you, because you actually have to convince your chief executive to actually say something that he or she may be uncomfortable with, because he's never done it before. It's an interesting challenge, and I don't really know how to overcome that other than using the logic argument that a strong start is your moment of maximum impact. That's how you create momentum. And generally, that's how you establish the credibility with the audience. But it's a bit tricky if you've never done it before. So it has to be kind of in the continuation of the overall strategy, in the continuation of what you might have done in the past, probably rather than a step change. But it's something that we're thinking about, really including in this, in the statement, in the script. The second point is the message-driven script. I said earlier before, every page you start with the key message, not with the facts. The facts are just the backup. So every time you turn the page, you start with, boom, whatever the key message is. Transitions, key. How often do you go through a presentation where basically the presenter will say, and on the next page, 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 and on the next page? Right? Not very exciting. Key transitions are actually really, really useful again to grab the audience's attention. Because if I really want to, I'll go back to this page. You've now read this page. You're bored with this page. I can now make a point about what is coming on the next page without you looking at this page anymore, because you're done with this. So the actual transition I can make here, which is completely irrelevant to this page, is going to draw you back in because you have to now listen to me again. And it's often forgotten that the transition isn't just the page flip. The transition is what I say. Done with this. Now let me tell you how I really think you should be writing a script. Oh, now everybody perks up again. Oh, I want to hear how you're going to write the script. Click, next page, how do you write a script? I'm exaggerating for a moment, but essentially that's what you use transitions for. And obviously, if you do a phone call with investors, it helps people then to kind of follow along. Right? You have to insert in the script the kind of, right? Now, if you look at page 5, you can see kind of stuff, but that's just the technical elements of helping people follow along. And make sure you conclude. How often do you actually go to a presentation where the final words spoken by the actual presenter are kind of like, and I'll hand back over to my colleague. Right? Again, I'll exaggerate for a moment, but actually people frequently just want to get the hell out of here. I'm done. And they don't actually spend their time really nailing the point again. Again, not as simplistic as tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them again, right? But make sure you come with a proper conclusion. You'll be surprised how often it doesn't happen. Or how often the handover is very poorly done. Again, in the German or Dutch world, that's just theater. We don't need that. Well, it looks dumb if you don't do it well, so you might as well do it well. And people will actually see it. I've been to presentations where there are 5 people sitting here, and in the back row where you're sitting over there next to the camera is a psychologist, brought along by the buyer. Not to say anything, but to observe the dynamics between the team members. You may not know that there's a psychologist sitting there, but you are on show the whole time. Management is on show the whole time. The IR team might be on show the whole time too. Right, so this is what I would suggest, right? The message-driven structure again, presentation and the script completely linked with that. So now let's think about connecting with the audience for a moment. So you have the presentation, you have the script. Couple things. Make it sound conversational. No one is ever going to get a prize for the best use of the German language in an IR event. Especially not if you know that actually there are people who can write sentences that go over 10 lines and then have the verb at the end. Now that doesn't work in English very well, but in German it does. It needs to be conversational, not high quality written language. Short, punchy sentences are more likely to get remembered. Right? In the simplistic world, flour, eggs, and milk. Right? It does get remembered. It's about as short as it gets. But right? Short, punchy sentences, that's what's going to hit home. 40% sustainable EBIT margin. Everybody will pay attention and will figure out if that is real. And if you can make that real, here's my money. Don't worry about repeating messages. I need to remember the messages when I leave the room. So if the CEO mentions the message, great. If the COO mentions the same message, great. If the CFO mentions the same message, probably not a bad thing either. It's not about it being, and I'll use another McKenzie metaphor for a moment, it doesn't have to be me-see. Mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. Don't go there. It makes for a nightmare in investor relations or in normal communications, but at McKinsey it is key. It can be repetitive. Avoid words that are not conversational. Again, how many German-speaking people would use the word simultaneously all the time when they speak English? Maybe some do. The short version of it is at the same time. So that's exactly the same thing, and it's much easier. That's what you do in speaking language. At the same time, we did that. Simultaneously, when we're considering all of our options, avoid stuff that you don't use normally. Avoid jargon. Right? Simple alternatives is easy. Avoid jargon. Whatever might be insightful to you doesn't mean it's insightful to the audience. Right? There are plenty of examples of jargon use that don't make much sense that the audience may not get. So as long as you know that, don't do it. And I'll use English here as an example, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It is speaking speak. It is not about punctuation, and it's not about grammar. I use 3-word sentences from time to time without a verb. Doesn't matter. That's how you connect with your audience. put that in the script. It's totally fine. It doesn't have to be, and that's the critical point. It doesn't have to be written language. It's spoken language. So the script should be written in spoken language, not in written language. And that's for many people very difficult. A, because they don't really know how to write speaking language. B, because they think their CEO or CFO is going to flip out when they see kind of short sentences like this, right? It sounds really silly, but it's a skill set that actually a lot of people either don't have or feel uncomfortable about applying. And then we get to the last point on the page here. To really have impact, you talk less, you say more. If you write a script, don't make it, right? Keep it short, keep it focused, keep it message driven. Make the point you want to make. The joke is, a lot of people think the presentation is the end all be all. But it's actually not. Right? As I said at the very beginning of the presentation, connecting with your audience isn't just about presenting well. It's actually making it interactive. It's actually about taking their questions. I can think in advance, what do they need to hear? But at the same time, they're going to feed back with questions. And I can present as well as I can. If I can't answer the questions, I've lost, right, a lot of this professional credibility, a lot of this potential conviction that I've shown in the presentation. People will then say, well, that was just a load of hot air. He actually didn't even know the answer to my question. And a lot of people actually forget that you score a lot more points in Q&A than with the set piece presentation. Right? I'll get to this in a second. I'll come back to this in a second. Right? We all know about figure skating at the Olympics. There's a compulsory program and there's a freestyle program. The compulsory program basically means you have a whole bunch of judges standing around to see if you can actually do a figure eight. That's essentially what the presentation frequently turns out to be. It's a set piece. Everybody knows that you have been prepared for this. The presentation is written by your staff, whatever it is. There's a script written by the staff. The lawyers have looked at the script. The bankers have looked at the script. The chances are you've been media trained to deliver the script. Right? You may have even had someone like me involved to help you do all that stuff. Everybody knows it's trained. But it's essentially just a skill that you need to have in order to really win the gold medal. Because if you score okay there, you get into here. If you don't score there, you don't even get there. But this is where you're really going to make the win the medal. It sounds very silly, but a lot of people don't remember that this is potentially more important than the set piece. A lot of time and effort gets put into the set piece. Q&A preparation, Q&A rehearsal rarely ever happens. Right? I'll leave the AGM concept aside for a moment, where you have the chief executive sitting here and basically the answers are coming either on the screen here or in an ear plug or whatever, because there's half the team sitting behind the wall. Right? That's great, but that doesn't work if you're sitting across the table from Fidelity or BlackRock or Capital Group. It doesn't work. If they have questions and you can't answer the questions, your set piece presentation, out the window. It's only half the job. It sounds really silly, but it really is something that a lot of people ignore in terms of the overall preparation. So now I'll go back to where I was here in terms of this optimal performance. Clearly Q&A is part of that. So first of all, I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier. The script needs to emphasize the main points. If you do that well, chances are it's going to be easy to read And the chances are it's going to be easy to follow, and easy to remember. You do need to have a bit of familiarity with the script. If you've never seen it before, chances are you're not going to read it very well if you're the reader of the script. It's a bit tricky, right, to tell a CEO or CFO that he needs to rehearse reading a script. Yeah, what are you going to tell us? Someone who reads off a script all the time? I don't need to rehearse it. But it's probably worth thinking about. Because the risk is you just sound like you're reading it from paper. There's not many CEOs who are actually very good at reading scripts. There are some who are very good at presenting without a script. There are very few who can actually really read a script in an engaging manner. And it's even worse if you do this on a conference call, where basically people don't say, the assumption is, well, it's on a conference call, no one can see me, so I just basically run through the script. Now, you listen to bondholder calls, which are the worst offenders at the end of the day. Right? You listen to calls with bondholders, and it's literally the CFO has been given a script that he probably hasn't even looked at because he doesn't care about bondholder communication. It's like number 15 on the list of priorities. They will just run through it. You listen there, you can absolutely hear he's just reading something he hasn't read before. No intonation, no emphasis, no nothing. They need to be integrated in the script. You need to highlight what and where the individual who's presenting needs to emphasize. Build in pauses. Right? You may have noticed this or you may not have noticed this. But if I make a point that I want you guys to remember, I'll shut up. And only continue once I think, right, some people in the room have actually absorbed the point. If you do this one-on-one, it's very simple, right? Because you'll nod or you say, yep. In the audience, no one does it really. But I still got to give you the opportunity to absorb the point. So I just shut up. And that requires a bit of confidence too. So, last point I was going to make here is really this Q&A bit, right? It's make sure you get people to spend time on Q&A. Yes, I know the business inside out. There's no question anybody can ask me that I will not know the answer to. Bullshit. Capital markets communication is all about nuances. And you look at how often actually the questions are answered in a bad way, potentially even a wrong answer, or potentially is relatively brusque Dutch or German approach. Sorry, no comment. Sorry, I can't say that. Sorry, we don't give guidance. Right? You ask an Englishman that question, you'll get a minute worth of talk and then say, but as you can imagine, that is not something I'm willing to disclose at this very moment in time. Right? You ask a Dutchman the same question, the answer is, sorry, no guidance. Right? It's all about how, at the end of the day, you deliver the answers. Obviously, they need to be in line with the story. That's what I said at the very beginning. But they also need to be in line in tone. It's about conviction. You need to be helpful. If I answer 3 questions in a very unhelpful manner, chances are you will be seen as unhelpful. Probably not the best way of being remembered by your key investors. And a lot of non-native English speaking people find it very difficult to give these capital markets nuanced answers that actually communicate something without saying anything that they can't say. And that's a skill set that you can only get from practice. Practice, practice, practice with the most difficult questions. Right? At the end of the day, if you take all of these 3 together, what you really are doing is you're creating a conversation, not a presentation. Even if you are presenting one-on-one to 50 people or to 5,000 people, it doesn't matter. It's all about creating a conversation, even if it's just one-way talking. So this I already showed you, right? The importance of Q&A. We all prepare questions, answers. Sorry, we prepare the questions, but more importantly, we prepare the answers to the questions. Key thing is, make sure you have the right answer to the right question and that you consistently deliver those. Now, you go on a roadshow with your senior executives and they do this 10 times in a day, right? And they start inventing new answers to the same flipping question just because they're getting bored. Probably not a good idea. So that bit of discipline and consistency is key. It's great if you answer the question really nicely at a very small kind of hedge fund based in Boston that you just kind of want to get as a new investor before you go down the street to Fidelity and completely bomb that same question and try to reinvent the answer to Fidelity. Not optimal. Right? It happens. That discipline is key. Concise answers. It's also very difficult. There's a lot of people who believe that they will show their control, command over the situation by talking a lot, giving detail. I actually like to suggest that the shorter you can give me the answer to the question I asked, the more in control, the more impressive I will think you are. I'm not sure if there's any French people in the room here, but the French are very good at over-answering every question. You ask a Frenchman a question, and the first answer is a non. And then they spend about 15 minutes or so actually coming up with the answer, that at the end of the day, the answer is, yeah, but you're actually right, therefore, blah. But that's a very kind of, that's the schooling system is very different. Right? It's very much more of a debate. So a question will lead to a debating type of answer. There's nothing wrong with it, as long as you're culturally aware that that may not be the right way of actually answering a question to an American fund manager at Fidelity in Boston. It may work very well if you're talking to, right, the big investors at AXA. Right? Who am I to judge when they speak French amongst each other? It may work very well. But think about concise answers. Understand the question, answer the question, and keep it as short as possible. And those are three things that are very difficult to do for people who think they're very important. And be surprised, by the way, how often actually even the most senior executives do not understand the question. Right? You guys have all been kind of facing these weird-looking people from the city in London, these analysts. But they have a very odd way of communicating, partially because they're not very good at it. They ask really difficult questions or really strange questions. Why are you asking me this question about deferred taxes? It's so irrelevant. But for him, it's relevant, because otherwise he won't be asking the question. So you get a question about deferred taxes. Right? I'm not an accountant, fortunately. But I know that most accountants can answer the question about deferred taxes, and it takes about 20 minutes. Right? Take the question on deferred, right? Give a concise answer, key. But you actually find out that most of the time they don't even understand the question asked by some of these analysts, because they ask them in a very odd way, very odd English way, very abrupt English way. So you're like, now did I get the question right? People start answering the question even before they've understood whether or not they're actually answering the right question. Look at it. You'll probably have plenty of examples where you've run into this. And finally, of course, the toughest questions. If your business isn't delivering on an element of your strategy, we all know you're going to get the questions. You might as well prepare for them. And the real joke here is, of course, try to mitigate the answers. Be really polished in how you answer the toughest questions, because that's where people are really going to see whether or not they want to or not want to give you more money. And that's not about telling them hot air. That's just telling them, showing your conviction in the business case that, yes, it may not be going as well as we thought it would, but we're still going to deliver, or whatever you feel like saying. You take this, and I'll take another cultural expose for a moment. Dutch, German versus Anglo-Saxon. If I ask a question to a German or a Dutchman, the answer, and I say, so I see you have a problem in accounts receivable. The Dutch or a German CFO will answer that question invariably, yes, you're right, we have a problem in accounts receivable. At which point I'm actually no longer interested in what comes afterwards. There is a problem, I don't like it, I'm not buying. The Anglo-Saxon approach to answering that same question is slightly different. They won't say there is a problem. There might be one, but they're not saying there is one. And it's about that nuance that you create, where you're essentially not saying anything wrong or anything different, but you're just not acknowledging, per se, that there's a huge problem. Right? The Dutch and the Germans see the problem first and then the solution. The Anglo-Saxons go first positive and then caveat it and then end up with the positive again. And it's the same question with a different answer, or at least a different interpretation of what actually could be considered a similar answer. That bit is critical in preparation, and a lot of people don't think about it that way because they, again, are not necessarily thinking about where's the audience coming from. They're thinking with their own hat on how I would expect to be answering that question. Right? It's taken me a long time to actually learn this more British way of answering questions, but I think I can do it by now. This is how you really connect with your investors. This is when they're going to make the investment decision. You go on a roadshow, how often do investors tell you, I'm not interested in the book, I'm not interested in the presentation, I just have 5 questions for you. Right? Everything we've just done here is now completely moot. It's irrelevant. I prepared a presentation. I spent months figuring out how to do a figure 8. They're not even interested in the figure 8. They're only interested in this bit. How many of you watch the technical part of the Olympics figure skating? How many of you watch this? Investors are the same. Investors are not necessarily interested in the technical part, in the mandatory part. If they've been invested in the company for a long time, all they want is to ask you a few questions. Be prepared for it. Don't spoon feed them with another half hour, 35, 40 minutes, 45 minutes of presentation and leave 15 minutes for Q&A. Flip it around. 15 minutes presentation, 3 key messages. Shoot. Set out your own agenda first, then let them shoot. That's where you're going to get this program done much better than if you now force them into 45 minutes of that and 15 minutes of this. So, very briefly, a couple key benefits to the presenters. Either you're presenting yourself or your executives are presenting. Clear distinction, key messages, and evidence. Chances are your messages will be heard. None of this left, right, center, whatever. It just, boom, 3, 4 messages. Right structure, right sequence, right language. Critical to actually help people tell the story, help remember the story, maximize impact. Don't worry about use of language. And by the way, no investor is going to fault a German-speaking executive for not speaking perfect English. In fact, unless they are like me, it would look really odd if all of a sudden they are starting to read a script that makes them sound like they are perfect Americans, using American slang in the middle of a presentation, just because it kind of sounds good, make them feel like or look like or sound like American, whereas everybody knows they're a German pharmaceutical engineer, right? There's no reality check sometimes, right, in forcing people into being something that they are not, just so that they can come across more English than they actually are. This is a very interesting point. If you have a good script and well-prepared answers to questions, you avoid the whole idea of the whole notion of flying untested ideas into a presentation or into an answer. I already gave the example of what happens on a roadshow when people basically get bored after the 15th time and start reinventing the wheel. Right? Really, really, really try to avoid that. But this untested ideas bit, right, can be dangerous. And it does happen. All of a sudden a brainwave in the middle of a meeting with Fidelity that actually identifies a problem rather than a solution once you really think through what you've just said. Or spending a lot of time answering one question with a very long answer that actually becomes counterproductive, even contradictory, when you actually analyze what you've just said. So avoid that. Preparation of the script, preparation of the answers will help you avoid that a lot more than you think. And it's also very good for time management. If, as I just said, you want to have an investor call that takes an hour, don't let the CEO or CFO have free rein over a presentation, because invariably he'll spend more time talking than he's supposed to. A good script will help him manage time. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it is, without having to do an awful lot of rehearsing. So it's actually very efficient for the executive to work with a good script, so they can go on and run the business. That's what they're being paid for frequently. So, achieve your objectives. High impact communication, memorable messages, prompting a Q&A dialogue. Those are the key things I think that we want to accomplish. Positive impressions, objective and subjective. At the end of the day, it's not just about the facts. Some Germans believe it is. The rest of the world actually does believe in subjective judgment as well when it comes to business case. Assurance under pressure. Right? Be confident even when you get tough questions. And generally speaking, I would suggest that for the executives, right, well supported by you guys, there will be less time in preparation for everybody if you follow the kind of approach that I just laid out. And that's where we then end up. High impact IR, lasting positive impressions, conviction, maximize value. Any other questions? Good. Thanks, guys. Good.
Sorry, I
Yeah.
have one actually.
Okay.
How often would you rework those key messages? Because you can't keep repeating the same thing for 5, 6 years in a row.
5, 6 years will be pushing it, but it's driven by the company's strategy. If the company is doing what the company says they're going to be doing, you don't have to change the key messages anytime soon. Right? But it's what you want, it's what you think the market needs to hear to keep on buying your shares. Putting it bluntly, that changes. I mean, if you do this well, at least you have a consistency throughout the whole kind of sequence of reporting with those key messages. Right? It typically can take 1, 2, 3 years. I mean, I've seen lots of companies where nothing changes. And the only thing you end up doing is just report results. More results, more results, more results. But there are no messaging around the results anymore, at which point you're also missing the opportunity to convince people to actually come into the shares. So that's why I go back to the earlier point. Right? Use every opportunity to make, right, investors aware of the journey, your vision. Where are you taking the company? And use the results as evidence that you're delivering on this.
What is your advice to deal with the safe harbor statement? You know, it's a must be included in the presentation.
Just have this. I mean, you
How to
start
do
your
it?
presentation with saying, thank you for inviting me to this conference, and I'll use a safe harbor statement, and then you lose your start.
Yeah, I mean, if you want my advice, I'll give you the advice. Right? The advice is, don't waste your time with it, and don't waste my time with it if I'm a listener. Right? I don't know if your lawyers will allow you to not say it. Right? But I actually don't see any reason, right, why you can't have that conversation with the lawyers and take the disclaimer and move the disclaimer to the very last page of the presentation, right, and not even refer to it. Or if you feel like there's a need to refer to it on page 2. By the way, strong start, blah, 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 blah. Oh, guys, before we continue now, right, let me just remind you that there is a safe harbor statement, right? There is a disclaimer at the end, right? But the notion that you actually have to sit there and read through a 3-paragraph safe harbor statement, I find mind-numbingly stupid. And you should tell your lawyers that I'm not going to do this, and then see if they push back. Because I don't think they will if you, right? Or you just, right? Good.